minutes past and I want to give Ashley plenty of time. So I'm going to jump in and start us off. So welcome everybody. This is Lauren Work. I'm one of the co-chairs of a content interest group, along with Matt Schultz, who's also on the call today. And we have a few things to walk through before we start our content call today with Ashley Bluer. And the first of which is a reminder for everyone, hi Matt, if you're coming to DigPros 2018, which is in October, zooming up on us very quickly, please come to our content interest group working lunch. So I know, I don't know if everybody's able to make it to digital preservation or DLF this year, but we are holding a working group lunch or an interest group lunch, and we would love to chat with everybody there. All of the great kind of momentum that we've built over this year came, it stemmed out of that meeting last year. So I really want to encourage folks to come by, say hello. We'll talk about, everything we did this year, maybe plans for next year, and what we want to do as a group. So that's the first thing. The second was I wanted to highlight too, Paige, who is also part of our lovely content interest group, is going to be doing an infrastructure interest group call on the 17th of September around security issues. So if your organizational environment permits you answering a very quick survey, let me see, I meant to drop it into the notes here. And I will also put it into our chat. So Paige is leading this call around security issues that folks may have encountered. And I think that would be a great thing to attend if you can. I think it's going to be a really interesting talk. And other quick things are, yeah, hey Paige.
About that. Hi,
yeah.
This is Paige. I'm at the Boston College Library account here. Please fill out that survey. We have had no responses so far.
Oh man.
I'm gonna have to give like a super boring talk about general definitions of
NDSA
and network security, and it's gonna be really
well, I think maybe just as entering, would it help if folks maybe can't do it institutionally to at least send maybe a note saying this is something that has been, restricted? I wonder if yes, please fill out the form if you can, but also, let folks know maybe why you can't. Would that be interesting, Paige? Would that be useful?
I guess so.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Fill it out if you can. Give Paige something to chat about because I'm sure she's got a lot of insight. Yes, thank you, Paige. And a few quick updates to working group updates. The National Agenda team, we're furiously writing and hoping to have drafts available, hopefully maybe around DLF time, so late October. The Levels of Preservation reboot is also going ahead full steam. I've put a link into our agenda around the various subgroups that have popped up. All of them have charters, co-chairs, and there's really a great amount of momentum around doing some work on the levels of preservation, particularly various subsets that people are interested in. And there's folks, that are doing a lot of really good work, particularly on the access side. Shira and Paige and other folks have been working on that for some time, and we're hoping to do some complementary work with that. Lastly, Matt, I don't know if you had any cloud content interest group updates you wanted to touch on before we introduce Ashley?
Well, I guess just real quick to say, there should be some notes coming out either later today or early tomorrow from the meeting that we had this past Friday, which was great. Lauren had teed up for us, for that group, some exercises to do sort of data transfer and data recovery out of cloud systems like Google Drive. So we talked a little bit about that during the call, and people had some interesting findings. I had some interesting findings from GVSU from doing some of that. So Lauren, thanks again for teeing some of that up.
Awesome. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, and then we got things rolling a little bit more concretely for the breakfast working group that's going to be at NDSA at the DigiPreds. The morning of the 17th, I think, or the 18th, I can't remember, but it'll be in the notes. We've been working this past year on a fixity comparison resource from vendors, and I met with Bill Brannon and Dave Picoler this past week, and we agreed to really start kicking off some new work with that resource. So we'll unpack that a little bit at the breakfast working group.
Great.
So look for the notes for that.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Ashley, for being patient with our many updates. And I wanted to go ahead and introduce Ashley. So AV preservation was the #1 thing in the survey we put out at the beginning of the year to the group, that people were interested in learning more about AV preservation, all things AV. And so Ashley, I'm very excited to highlight, has been working on these issues and related issues for some time. So Ashley's bio is that she specializes in time-based media preservation, digital repository management, infrastructure community building, computer to human interpretation, and teaching technical concepts. She works at Artifactual Systems as their AV preservation specialist. She's also an active contributor to Media Area's MediaConf, which is an open source digital video file conformance checker software project, and Bay Area Video Coalition's QC Tools, which is an open source digitized video analysis software project. And she holds a Master of Library and Information Science with a concentration in archives and a Bachelor of Arts in Graphic Design from the University of South Carolina. And I'm also going to drop her website into the chat because it is an excellent resource for AV and beyond. There's a lot of really awesome teaching and other resources here that Ashley has worked on. And so with that, I just want to remind folks that for the logistics of the presentation, we're going to hold questions for the end. So Ashley will have time to walk through her preservation and AV presentation. And so if you have questions in the interim, feel free to drop them in chat and we'll make sure to address them again at the end. And that this session is also being recorded and will be up for review and use later on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley and take it away.
All right, let me unmute myself. Let me move things all around. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for everyone for inviting me. I think everything should be coordinated and I think everyone can hear me fine, right? But everyone's also muted. We tested this before. So, yeah, it's always funny talking to a computer and knowing that you're talking to a bunch of humans as well. But yeah, so I already got an introduction who I am, but I just want to mention that there's a lot to do here, and then I'm going to assume that everyone has some knowledge about digital preservation and about archives, and I'm going to try to hit on what makes AV unique. So I might be skipping over some things that we know are important, but I'm going to try to touch on like the highlights here. And thanks Lauren for hyping my website. This is more specifically, I think the training.ashleybluer.com, where you can find all my training resources that are available on the website. They go more in depth about some of the things I'll talk about today and some of the things I won't really have time to cover, but especially more specific details into the tools and learning how to use them and examples of how they are used. And then the specific deck is loaded at the smaller URL, which is bits.ashleybluer.com/talks, and it should be up here. And I'll show what, probably show what it looks like. Maybe you can still only see training.ashleybluer.com, but you might also see, I think I shared the desktop. You should be able to see the actual website here. But if not, then you can go on your own. Sometimes, websites are a little tricky when sharing, but let's go. Let's get into this. So I want to talk about AV specific issues and go into what those look like. And then we can move on to talk more about solutions. So to kind of break it up half and half here. And I'm going to try to be conscious of time, but Lauren, feel free to interrupt, or anyone, honestly, feel free to interrupt me with questions at any time, or if I am running too long, or if I'm talking too fast. I heard that it's good to try to pretend like you're underwater when giving talks, and I'm trying that out now because I've gotten into the habit of hyping up and getting really excited about AV preservation and then going way too fast. And people just are missing what I'm saying. But these are some of the AV specific issues I just want to cover a little bit that are just unique to this space, especially if you're coming from working with other content, analog or digital, or coming from maybe a traditional archives training in which some of these might not have been highlighted. I went through a traditional MLIS program for archives, and none of this was necessarily covered in my standards archives classes. So we'll talk about format confusion first, just so we can give sort of an overview of the kinds of things we're working with. Storage, things are very, very big. That's usually the biggest surprise. I think time is involved in the sense of viewing things and listening to things, but also doing things. And QA can be really labor intensive in a way that other things are not. Migration has to happen before assessment. I'll talk about that later. And then old hardware, new hardware issues, and of course money is always like the sticker shock of doing this kind of work is maybe the truest, hard, most difficult burden to overcome. That and, you know, storage are sort of tied. And then sort of like, what do you do after this? I think there's something specific to AV there. So I'll start just by talking about formats for a minute. Each format will need sort of special treatment, and there are 3 major audiovisual formats, and this is including both audio and video, and that's film, tape, and digital. And then specifically within these formats, there's many different formats. So for film, it can go from 8mm to 70mm and beyond, and in between, and all sorts of variations of that. With magnetic media, you know, there's lots of different tape and there's lots of different plastic. They're all in different sizes. There's dozens of things that have been rolled out over the years. For digital, everything ends up compiling down to ones and zeros, but the trick is sort of decompiling it in order to make it available on machines into the future, and working with machines from the past and how those don't necessarily carry over, and technologies from the very recent past can't necessarily even be played back today. So that's sort of a unique burden the digital video has. And then there's like pick and mix, which is there's film with magnetic media audio tracks. I've had to work with those before in previous positions in which, you know, it's not side by side, it's stuck onto the film. And so it's really hard to have to grapple with dealing with both at the same time. Tapes can certainly have digital video on them. And so you have digital content on a physical carrier that's not a hard drive. And not forgetting about audio, which is like wax and vinyl, which are completely different mediums with which information is on and has to be taken out of and pulled into the digital space. So digitization in general is like a big, is one of the bigger issues. And just as an aside, I think video rolls off the tongue better for me than AV, but I'm not forgetting about audio, and I'm not forgetting about film. And I'm not trying to show any like internal biases here, but maybe I accidentally am. But if I end up saying video, I'm trying to be comprehensive here in covering all of these different topics. Like, to be biased, I think the video is certainly the most difficult of the bundle, digital and analog. So for storage, I think that this crowd is pretty well versed in the issues of digital storage. I think it can be very, very, very big though. I think an uncompressed video can be many, many gigabytes and can sort of like totally overwhelm the existing collections. So if you've been working with only documents and with images for a long time, and then you get some videos, and it's so easy for those videos to completely dwarf the entire collection. So it can sort of really make you have to rethink your entire storage infrastructure sometimes. Time, you know, like I said, it takes time to do stuff, takes time to watch and listen to stuff. And it also takes time to move stuff around because these files are so large and you're dealing with them. You have to budget in a lot of time for just processing and sending things through different workflows and checksums and doing all the metadata gathering and monitoring and stuff like that. It can take a lot more time than maybe one is used to when doing this kind of work, digital preservation work. And I kind of hinted on before is that digitization for anything that's analog coming into the digital sphere, it has to happen before you can know what that content is about, which sort of often throws a wrench into people that are coming at this from, like I said, a traditional archives background, and they maybe want to do something like some sort of processing beforehand, sort of curation, selection, assessment, even acquisition. But that can't necessarily be done unless, you know, you're sort of limited to what's physically on the carrier, and also trusting that that is authentic. So that can be a big burden where you have to rethink your workflows in really, really like important ways, and really ways that are upfront before a project begins. So, and you can't think about anything like MPLP. So you have to do sort of all that work up front and then come in and do some sort of like minimal processing later. But the minimal amount of processing that you have to do just to get things accessible is digitization, which is very costly and very labor intensive. So also, I think hardware knowledge is a big burden. You have to be or have on staff or consult with an expert on really, really old stuff, like really old hardware, video decks, things like that. And then also someone who's an expert on really, really new stuff. And you need new computers to do this work. You need the, you know, relatively latest technology. And then you have to figure out what's becoming out of date on modern machines, and how can you sort of bridge that gap between what the modern machine can do with what the old machine can do, and what's the in-between here on sort of making those work together. Because sometimes it's not just hardware, it's also software issues. Software or proprietary formats and things like that sort of block access to things that you might have previously had access to if the computers were older, or if the technology or the hardware was less old. And they can also both be equally expensive, just sort of the next topic. But having machines that are powerful enough to do the sort of processing work to deal with video, you'll have to spend a lot of money to get like an up-to-date machine, but you'll also have to spend a lot of money on getting the old hardware. And sort of a big problem about AV things is that we're running out of decks to be able to do this digitization work. And I think I talk about this again a little later, but that kind of work can really, like it's hard to track down. You have to have an expert being able to know what kind of decks are good, and then buying those decks, you know, it's easily like hundreds of, and sometimes thousands of dollars, and just getting set up. And you need that for each format. Or of course, alternatively doing it out of house, but it's still, then that person is doing that work too. And then it's ending up coming down to the financial line. And to be like super cheesy here, it's like thinking about it in terms of a picture's worth 1,000 words. And then each second of a film or a video is somewhere between like 16 to 60 pictures per second plus audio. So it's worth a lot just financially in terms of upkeep and just getting things out moving along and into sort of safe spaces and accessible spaces on computers. So, and then after all this decision making, which you're probably coming at without sort of knowing how to approach it, you have to be able to go two directions with it, and you have to preserve it, and you also have to be able to share it. And that can also be complicated because video and audio are complicated, and that kind of thing can often take a lot more thought than you might have anticipated. You know, you're not just working with one format, you're working, one format for preservation and one format for access. You're working with multiple formats and in working together with each other for each preservation and for access. And so making those decisions and coming up with the right sort of thing for your institution can be challenging. And I think I don't want to leave out even more complex media too, but I think a lot of the same practices still apply. I think this is really like the new emerging field, but likewise, there's very large files. There's migration from a legacy carrier to a modern one, just like an older computer to a new computer. There's still degradation and loss to worry about. There's multiple format streams, just sort of like something I don't even think maybe I get to cover it a little bit later. And then objects have to move through time to be perceived. And so all of that has to be sorted out for AV first. And it'll give you a good start on the things that will be coming into archives now, like in the present and in the future, and also the recent past, things that have already come into archives and people don't know how to handle them. So it's easy to get sort of overwhelmed with this stuff. I think especially when talking about video and people speak using the term crisis, like we're in a magnetic media crisis, meaning we're truly at end of life for the magnetic media carriers. And like I hinted on before, like the hardware is going to burn out before the tapes are going to burn out. So the problem is sort of that finding a way to get them off of a carrier is more difficult sometimes than the carrier themselves. So those are, of course, also precious materials that won't survive much longer, especially if they're not in good conditions. So I find in my experience, a lot of people have come to me in my role when I was working as an independent consultant, primarily because they're faced with migrating this media for the first time. And they're running into these sort of previously unanticipated issues. So I want to go a little bit now from big to small and thinking about the kinds of solutions that might be good to look into for dealing with all of this. Is everyone feeling okay right now? Are there any active questions lingering that I maybe didn't cover? I'm gonna take a sip of water and then we'll keep going. Thank you, Lauren. So sort of at the biggest level, the issues to think about are ecosystems. This is certainly not comprehensive. I just threw things out here and I started to myself get overwhelmed thinking about all the different potential solutions that are available. But a lot of these listed are, well, the first couple ones that are concepts that you have to think in mind, and then not even just a framework around building an ecosystem to deal with this. And then others are open source software solutions, I think, that handle this kind of work. But a lot of these are processes managers. They don't even like a lot of these don't necessarily even cover things like metadata generation, for instance, or cataloging or tracking work, are other things that need to happen as part of a normal archival workflow. But an ecosystem like one of these, it's sort of the biggest thing someone can think about. And certainly digital preservation can happen very successfully without any of these systems. But sort of thinking about if you're thinking about doing a very large project and sort of the, I don't want to use the term burden, but like the work that must be done to be taken on, and sort of thinking about how big it can be. You could look in some of these and sort of see what they do and how they operate, and maybe talk with other people about whether or not, or like what they've learned from these, and whether or not it's been successful for them, or what they might change when you're thinking about doing this sort of stuff. And then workflows would go in here. Like that's sort of, I feel like, the biggest topic right now is how do you even move through this and do all of this work? But these are some potential solutions here for doing this. I'm trying not to, since I'm here independently of my employer, I'm trying not to hype Archivematica explicitly, but I won't. I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna be good. So the next big thing, the really big thing, I think, is storing files. And there's a lot of experts in this, and it probably in this audience and then beyond. And I think it's something, usually with this, I really like to trust and leave to IT experts in dealing with. They've really solved these redundancy and replication problems 1,000 times over. And this is certainly also not comprehensive to storing files. I have a storage slide deck that goes into more details sort of about all of these. But I want to highlight the middle one, which might be unfamiliar to people who aren't necessarily working with very big file sizes. But it's pretty popular in the AV space, and that's LTO, which is linear tape open. And it's the process of digitizing all this stuff and then sending it, back to tape and back to digital media on a very high capacity, long-term safe storage solution. Oh, sorry about that. So comment from Lauren, if people can't see the chat later. Okay, there we go. Is that I must have been highlighting the wrong. Let's see if I'm, okay, I'm in sync with the world right now. Right? It's all good? yeah, but yeah, so sending all the stuff back to tape is sort of what you can do. And it's also very good for environmental decision making because it's, you know, pretty low cost and low energy for dealing with very big file sizes. And these are used also by very large tech companies too. I think anecdotally coming into this field, I was like, wait, you're putting all this on, you're getting all this off of tape and then you're just putting it on tape again? What's the point of this? Isn't this the same problem? But I feel like Google uses this too, so it's pretty like good technology. It's made by IBM. But that's sort of one solution for storing a lot of this file when you can't just leave it all on spinning disks because it's just much too expensive. So moving from there, I'm not gonna cover metadata. It's like a massive field in all of its own. But I wanna highlight here to not underestimate the requirement for transcribing all video. So anything that goes online has to be transcribed with closed captioning readily available. And that can be a very large task. And I think that in the past, maybe before a year ago, when this started to actually come up in legal cases in courts, this was maybe something that people didn't think about. I've worked at places where people didn't think about it, you know, but it needs to be thought about because I think people are much more careful now, and it is something that you can't just do last minute to throw into a workflow. It's getting harder to sort of get those transcriptions in place. This also sort of mentally reminds me to make a slide deck sort of dedicated to solutions here, since I can't necessarily rattle them off at the top of my head. But there are ways that you could creatively do this sort of transcription work, or there's a lot of like new emerging crowdsourcing solutions that have come out in years past and in the future too. But that's a big thing that I think a lot of people don't think to do. And then I think collaboration is important, and I'm not going to go into it. NDSA is certainly a good example of working together with peers to do this kind of work. But I do want to not forget that people are such a huge component of digital preservation. So working with peers is a crucial part of getting these things accomplished. And so this is when I can start like going off the rails a little bit in terms of rambling about what we can do. So this is sort of the work that like in my bio mentioned that I have been doing, is like the small and the next slide, which is sort of like the nitty-gritty work into how to do these things. So I'll just mention a couple. Yeah, I think it's legally required in the States if you are, like a public institution or something like that, which I've just happened to work for, I think, only public institutions. Or anything that's an educational institution too, probably, maybe regardless if it's public or private. But also, I'm not an expert or a lawyer, so please do your own work. And Lauren knows a lot about this. Like I said, I need to do more research on that issue, but it's something that you have to be very aware of if you're making things accessible. It's not like necessarily required for preservation, but it is something that's important for preservation. You know, super metadata. But transcription is an example of like getting down into the sort of like nitty gritty of things that you have to worry about that are hard. So I'm just going to mention a couple things here. I'll mention FFmpeg, which is a huge multimedia framework. It's a complete cross-platform solution to record, convert, and stream audio and video that can be used to turn things around. And I think too, normalization, I think is like a contentious topic in preservation still, probably forever. But when dealing with objects that used to be analog and now must become digital, it's not a question of if something should be normalized or not, because it has to be. It's moving into a completely new life cycle as a new format from analog to digital. And that format is a choice of people doing that preservation work. So it's sort of like talking about migration earlier. That's something that, like, like now if I'm like recommending like a disk image or something, I tend to be like, oh, just like leave it in there and then it's preserved and we can worry about that later. But it's like you don't get to worry about it later when it's something that has to be digitized. So you have to do a lot of work up front in making sure that that format is going to be good, and then potentially changing it later. But you want to make sure that you're making the right steps there, and that can be a whole field in itself. So like standardizing formats or standard formats, like picking the right format is like a 3-day workshop in itself. So I'm sort of hesitant to even touch it. It could also be very political, and I'm also personally very opinionated to give a brief summary, I fear, but it can take a lot of research, and it ultimately depends on what's right for your institution and for its capacity. And just like with storage, it's tied closely to storage and financial responsibility or financial assets that are available to you. And so a lot of these opinions will sort of have an impact on that and should be thought about when you're like, oh, if I want to do everything in this way, how is this going to impact things down the line? Those very like long tail of digital preservation. In this, assuming we can see the rest of my screen, I just want to highlight, I have a couple other decks to talk about this stuff, compression and codecs and containers. Let me flip over to back to the deck. So I didn't scroll down before, but there's, you know, all sorts of different things to learn about, either structured in paths or not. But there's video containers and video codecs that are like dedicated slide decks here that you can take a look at doing this stuff. Hopefully I wasn't covering my mic just there. That's a bad habit. But this is sort of like the breadth and depth of things you have to think about when you're doing file conversion, which is streams, containers, codecs, color spaces, compression, chroma subsampling, television displays, pixels, bit depth, color depth. Yeah, I'm reading my slide. But I'll stop because it's a lot to worry about and think about. Time codes, which I didn't highlight earlier, are something that seem very simple and seem like they're always fine. But a lot like transcriptions, it's sometimes it can be a lot more work than you knew or anticipated. And also all this other stuff, chroma subsampling and pixels and pixel depth and pixel width. But you can check out those slides for more info about that. Let me get back to where I was. And then I just want to touch on sort of this last part of the piece, the very smallest, which is file validation, which is where I've done even more specific work on. And I just want to talk about a couple of these tools and what they do, and then you could look them up later, or even, of course, contact me at any time to understand what they do a little better. Or you can use those training resources too. I think a lot of these are covered there. But I want to mention Media Info, which is a metadata extraction tool. So it sort of displays the technical and tag information for many types of files, focused especially on audio and on video. And then there's MediaConch, which is built on top of Media Info, and it consists of an implementation checker, policy checker, reporter, and fixer. And those work together to offer an advanced level of ability to validate, assess, and find solutions to repair the digital files within collections. And those can also be used sort of in bulk. And QC tools, as we mentioned before, or it was in my bio, is also, it's coming up on a very big new release very soon, and I'm really excited. So there'll be a lot of like new features there, but it's a software tool. It's a, which is also, I'll mention that all three that I mentioned so far work like on the command line, but they also work as like a graphical user interface. So you can like click around, but QC tools especially is like a piece of software, but it helps users analyze and understand digital video files. And so you can sort of see things that you can't see with the naked eye. I think a lot of that work comes out of wanting to replicate the processes for QA that was used in analog media. Although it's not limited to use for analog video files, but you know, it can be used on digital video files for analysis as well. It's sort of built on the same things that are built on FFmpeg, which uses a lot of these features too, but it sort of makes it a little easier for preservationists to use and actually visualize live. And then Siegfried, Fido, File, and Jove, of course, are all like helpful in identifying these weird digital video files that you might come across. Pronom, of course, is a tool that's the exhaustive collection of file formats that are ever updating. I think there's a new release also coming very soon. And then FFProbe comes out of FFmpeg. It's for giving you a lot of metadata for every single frame of video for your video file, as well as audio. I think it took me a while to realize that audio also has frames too, because they're based in time. It's sort of chunked up that way so that you could do a really deep analysis of this work. And then DV Analyzer and all the meta edits, which is BWF meta edit, MOB meta edit, ABI meta edit. Those are sort of software tools that you use with specific video formats because they're all different. And it's sort of thinking about the difficulty of AV preservation is all these formats are made completely differently and require different kinds of care. And then finally, I think we're all well versed in fixity and checksums, but to note that they can take a really long time for big video files. And sometimes that can be anticipated too. And if you're working on older machines particularly, you know, sometimes it can take hours if you don't have a lot of processing power to run those. And maybe you have to run them overnight and do this work overnight and leave it running. But that can be, that you might have to change your workflow based on that. And I think that's something that may not be anticipated. But the good news is like a lot of this can be automated to work without you having to do anything. You can leave things going overnight. You can like start processes off and work on them later. But the bad news is, of course, it's like the sorcerer's apprentice. But the good news again is that we have each other, which is the best possible research. I'm being super cheesy today. I don't know why, instead of just broomsticks. So we at least can like work on doing it. But I think that's all I have for my talk, but I do want to hype that I will also be at DLF. I'll be with Lauren Work's colleague, Stephen Villarreal, and also Catherine Groundswell at Carnegie Hall. We'll be talking about open source workflows in more detail than today, specifically related to AV. That's Wednesday at 10:30. And then I'll also be speaking about the work Artifactual and Avalon are doing together on digital preservation and workflows for AV too. And that's Tuesday at 9:30. And I have no idea what the dates are. I just know like the days that I'm there. But yeah, that's it. Thanks. And I really love to answer any questions. And that's all.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. It's great. You're going to be very busy at DLF. So I wanted to open it up for folks to have, you know, any questions you've been holding on to that you want to ask Ashley about anything she's covered. I've got some questions, but I wanted to give the floor to folks first.
You can see me trying to mute myself again. Like, I got it.
Hi, Ashley. This is Paige again from BC. Thanks so much for obviously the presentation. It was great. One thing that we've been sort of struggling with here is caption files. We mentioned having to, when you're making them accessible, you have to do a lot more work. One of those things is captioning, which can be very labor intensive and expensive if you outsource it. And we outsource it and get basically like 20 different types of caption file options in return. And we don't want to save all of them because that's confusing, but we do try to save 2 of them, one of which is like an SRT format, which is super proprietary, and then one is like an open XML format, but I haven't been able to find any other documentation on what to preserve or anything, so I was wondering if you had any input.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that SRT was proprietary actually, but that's my own lack of knowledge. I think North Carolina State University has been doing a lot of work in this. I recommend reaching out to them maybe. And they've been using, I don't know if the other one, the XML format you were talking about, there's also WebVTT, and I think they send things out to there, and it's an open format, which is maybe a good option. And it's very easily readable. It's just a text format. With like the timestamp adjacent to it.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe SRT isn't proprietary, but it looked like a weird format to me that might go out of date, whereas XML probably isn't going to go out of date anymore.
Yeah. SIT, I think there's no standard. I think that it's sort of whatever people want to do. That's just been my experience, like watching video on the internet as a teenager, honestly, though. And it's just but the unfortunate truth too is like the people that have done the most of this work are like teens on the internet watching like subtitled video. And that like we need to jump in and sort of take the initiative and what needs to be done. I think that's just it's a lack that we haven't hit at yet.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Ashley about anything big, small? She covered a lot.
There's a text question.
Oh, yes.
Let's see. We lean in.
Let's see.
Oh. Oh, mass transcoding.
Great question.
So they've already been ingested into a repository or like while they're transcoding? Oh my gosh, how do I? There's already like so much to cover in like a short period of time. And then I kept like, while presenting, I was like, wait, I forgot to talk about.
Maybe this should be part 1.
I know, yeah. Oh, let's see. I don't know if I know how people have handled it necessarily. I think setting up machines, just trying to think back on my own experience. In Archive Medica, there's a normalization function, and that it should run smoothly to get that information into different formats that have been sort of vetted by people who are also archivists and preservationists. And that it would be handled by that system. And then other people have been doing it sort of in-house, either just on extra computers. I think the New York Public Library does everything in-house for transcoding. Obviously, digitization happens both, not obviously, that's not obvious to people, sorry. Happens both inside and out of house. And I mean, I think it's been successful. I'm trying to think of like maybe the hang-ups there. Are you trying to ask like the triggering factors into why transcoding would happen? Or maybe I need more information to answer this question. Oh, okay. So what would cause something to be normalized or not normalized? I think, and what can I speak about that I know about that everyone can know about? So it's just hard being in like a new client-facing role.
Right.
Let me think. I think a lot of times, sometimes people want their content to all be uniform and to be the same. And so if things have been maybe digitized in the past, assuming we're working with something that is going day-to-day analog to digital, and then processes have changed and you want everything to be the same so that you can monitor them all exactly in the same way in the future and not have some like strange files lurking around that are different formats. That might be a good reason why people decide to normalize or to normalize to a specific format or to change it up once things are already in there. Let me think. I think that it could be that maybe sometimes it is to save space. Some things have been transcoded. I think the de facto for a long time was uncompressed media, which can be extremely large. And then there's sort of a concept that I didn't have time to get into of lossless compression, in which you can make the files smaller, but you can also, you can shrink them down, but you're not losing any of the content. You can puff them back up again when you need to. Just, this sort of the same way, obviously much more complex because you're doing it to a video file, but like the same way sort of like how you zip a file or tar it to make it a little bit smaller, but you're not losing any of the content or any of its like pure form. And so there's been some decisions making along with that, in which someone would want to just save money. If you have tons and tons of files, it can save a lot of money long term when you're thinking about how do you take care of these over long periods of time. And that was definitely a decision at New York Public Library as well when I was working there that was made. And I had another before I go on to this other question, another reason why. Open formats are of course important. I think some people have been digitizing to things that might have been proprietary and then worrying about the long-term repercussions of that. If you can't ever fully understand your format, you may want to transcode it to something where somebody who has that technical knowledge can understand it long into the future, and you could always like decode what the issue is rather than having it sort of locked away. I think we've learned a lot from like Flash and other which is like a whole different kind of digital video, like Flash files, and how like you can't play them back now. So how do you deal with that long term, that kind of thing. This other question is, let's see, how do you approach working in a news or documentary video environment? How do you approach choosing what to preserve, assuming you can't save anything? Wow, I don't know. I feel like no one's the expert in that. I don't actually. I'm surprised at how little opinions I have on being able to curate content. I think it's scary.
Yeah, this is an interesting question that's come up around not just AV, but I think content in general. This curation selection question is continuous. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, it's like a conversation where you're the middle person between the creator and your managers that like hold the budget, like the finance officer of your institution. Yeah. I don't know. And then backlogs have always been an issue, right? So you can try to prioritize based on like, some people want to save definitely just like say we're gonna work on the final product right now and we'll keep this other stuff around, but maybe we won't be able to adjust it to the system. But yeah, I can't say I know.
Yeah, I think that could be a whole conference unto itself. That's true.
I know.
And everybody would come out with more questions other than
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard.
The people problem of digital preservation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, good question from Sarah. Just popped up.
Oh, it's long.
Yeah. Robust options for evaluating checksums.
Oh, okay. Let's see. So Sarah says, we have a lot of files that have already been digitized over the past 10 years. We regularly run checksums to make sure everything's still okay, which is great. Yeah. I saw a report recently that showed that a lot of people don't, so we're good.
Yep.
Yeah, sometimes we've run into issues where the checksums no longer match any of the capo. And then there's nothing obviously wrong with the files. How do you analyze them specifically as changed in the files? Yeah, it's very true. Checksums are very limited in sort of yes, no. I think some of the tools that I mentioned very briefly that I've worked on are MediaConch and QC tools for doing that kind of work, I think. But some of that work has to be happened at the beginning of a project. I would say that, and this goes back to sort of the earlier question too about why would people migrate to a specific format. And so sometimes I work hard, I neglect talking about things because I work hard to be like non-biased here. I worked on standardizing though the formats Matroska and FFA1 sort of for this purpose. Dave Rice initiated this work 4 or so years ago, and I've been working on that project sort of under him. And out of it came MediaConch. And so the reason why the European Union, to sort of, I'm trying to briefly summarize like the history of this project. The European Union has a commission to fund works, and they did research into finding out which video format might be the best to use for long-term preservation. And they chose these formats of Matroska, which is sort of the wrapper of the video file, and then the video codec inside FFV1 for that purpose, because FFE1, you could do checksums at the frame level. And so if the entire file fails to pass, you can go in and check each individual frame until you find the one that's the problem, and then assess it there, narrow it down. And also for Matroska files, you can, and this is why I really recommend wrapping things in Matroska files for preservation, not only because it's an open standard, but because it has checksums at each section of the file. And so you have sort of the content area, and then you also have like a metadata area, and you have like the header and stuff like that. And you could check each of those, and then you know if the metadata part changed, that maybe something happened with like a timestamp or any kind of like Unicode issue or something like that, and then you know the content itself is fine, and you can sort of move on and say, after you do your assessment, you're like, okay, this is sort of like what's wrong, and it's a mistake, but there's nothing wrong with the content, or there maybe is something wrong with the content. And then you could, if it's, for example, these two working in combination with each other, you could then go in and look and check all the checksums on every frame. And it can get more granular than that too. You can do every section of every frame. Well, that's usually like a conservation level sort of analysis. But those two I definitely recommend in looking at file size overhead this much to the file. Checksums are very tiny, you know, so I would say almost nothing. It wouldn't even be noticeable. But Matroska is only doing it for each like section, and then FFE1 is doing it for each frame, and that metadata can get very big if you're running all the metadata tools that I sort of mentioned. If you're sidecarring that data or ingesting or putting it within, it can get very large. So, but very large in relation to a video file is not that large at all. And so I think the conversation, my consensus on dealing with this stuff is like, in relation to the actual content, the metadata file, even if it's like 50 megs, it's not that much compared to the 50 megs that represents the like, 50 gigs of video. So you're already having to like use up a lot of space, so you might as well just shovel it all in there. Oh, this is a really technical question that I like, which is, all these questions I like, but have you run into pixel aspect ratio, square versus rectangular, and should the original ratio be kept when normalizing? Oh my gosh. I haven't personally run into this yet, although I look forward to sort of in this role that I have now working at Artifactual. But I think, I don't know, it sort of depends on what the original file was and what you're being normalized to, whether or not you should update the pixel aspect ratio. I think if you're normalizing, yeah, it depends, because it gets really hairy when you're thinking about all these details. I do recommend like making sure like an expert has reviewed like an FFmpeg script that you've decided to use on all your files, because there are things like pixel aspect ratio that can easily slip through the cracks in terms of like every one file in 1,000 will happen to be different, and you'll be like, well, why does this one look like this? So as long as you just use something very thorough and very consistently. It sort of depends on what the transcoder sort of has in mind and how it handles it. Yeah, sorry to answer the question with like it depends. I fear it though. I fear the pixel aspect ratio. Anecdotally, my parents digitized my video to DVD using like Walmart. So I hear someone laughing. But the pixel aspect ratio is totally messed up. And then I uploaded some to Vimeo and they corrected it. I mean, obviously that's not fixed, but like it's sort of funny. I couldn't save my own phone. We still have the tapes, so I can always redo them.
Oh, you still have the source tapes. That's good. Yeah,
I still have to get a little, it's like I have to age a little bit to still get over like having seen them again. But yeah, if like a some place like like digitization house isn't careful, then
Mm,
We'll end up with things just being, I was just very squished, you know.
yeah. And that's, well, we have like 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure that if anybody has any last quick questions for Ashley while we have her. We've had an awesome slate of questions so far. Okay, going once. Well, I just wanted to say thank you again to Ashley. This was great. For folks on the call or people who couldn't make it, we're going to record it and make it available, and hopefully have it up within a day or two. You can find Ashley, of course, at Artifactual, but also on her website with all the great training materials. Yes, thanks so much. Yeah, if anybody has any follow-up questions, Ashley, I know that you've got your contact information is on your website and elsewhere. But yeah, thanks again. This was great and really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And anyone could contact me at any time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Well, thanks again. And thanks everybody for coming today. Appreciate it. And we'll chat soon.